11 years. That is how long I waited for a single document that I believed would change my life. And when it finally arrived, I sat alone in my apartment, held it in my hands, and felt almost nothing. That was the moment I realized something had gone wrong. Not with the document. With me. With the life I had been building so carefully while I was waiting that I had forgotten to ask whether it was actually the life I wanted. I am going to tell you what those 11 years cost me. Not the money, not the career sacrifices, not the visa renewals and the lawyer fees and the paperwork that never seemed to end. I am going to tell you what I lost that cannot be measured. And I am going to tell you about the moment, sitting in a quiet restaurant on a cold evening, when a stranger said something to me that finally made me understand what I had been doing wrong for nearly a decade. Stay with me, because if you have ever left someone behind to build something better somewhere else, what I am about to tell you is going to matter to you. I remember the exact weight of my suitcase the morning I left. One piece of checked luggage, 23 kilograms, stuffed with things my mother had decided I needed, and things I had decided I wanted, and not nearly enough of either. My father drove me to the airport before sunrise. He didn't say much. He never did. But when I reached the security line and turned back to wave, he was still standing there, both hands at his sides, watching me go with the kind of stillness that only fathers who are holding something back can manage. I was 30 years old. I had an engineering degree, a job offer from a software company in a state I had to look up on a map, and the absolute certainty that I was making the right decision. I told myself it was temporary. 2 years, maybe 3. Get the experience, save some money, and come back with something to show for it. That was the plan. Clean and simple. Nobody tells you that immigration doesn't care about your plans. The first winter nearly broke me. I had grown up in a city where the coldest months still felt warm compared to what I walked into that January in the American Midwest. I wore every layer I owned and still felt the cold reach places I didn't know cold could reach. The apartment I shared with 3 other men from back home smelled like a combination of pressure cooker steam and desperation. We were all engineers. We were all lonely. We were all pretending, very convincingly, that we were fine. Work was the easy part. I was good at what I did, and in that environment, being good at what you do is enough to keep most other things from mattering too much. I arrived early and stayed late, not because anyone asked me to, but because the alternative was going back to that apartment and sitting with how far from home I actually was. The office had heating. The office had people. The office had problems I knew how to solve. Home had none of those things, and it had the kind of quiet that asks questions you are not ready to answer. In those first months, I called my mother every single day, sometimes twice. She would tell me about the neighbors, about what my brothers were doing, about the price of vegetables at the market, about everything ordinary and small that made up the life I had left behind. I listened to all of it with a hunger I hadn't expected. I hadn't realized until I was far away from ordinary how much ordinary was worth. My visa status in those early years meant I was tied to my employer in ways that took me a long time to fully understand. I couldn't simply leave and go somewhere else. I couldn't take certain opportunities even when they were offered. My immigration lawyer, a soft-spoken man who charged by the hour and always looked slightly tired, explained my situation with the patience of someone who had explained it many times before. The green card process had been started by my company. That was good news. The timeline was somewhere between 8 and 12 years, depending on factors neither of us could control. That was the other kind of news. I did the math sitting in my car in the parking lot after that meeting. 8 years minimum. I would be 38, 12 years maximum. I would be 42. I sat with those numbers for a while. Then I drove back to work. You adjust. That is the thing about human beings that I find both admirable and a little heartbreaking. We adjust. We normalize things that should feel impossible, and we build small lives inside large constraints, and we find ways to be okay that don't require everything to actually be okay. I adjusted to the waiting the same way I adjusted to the cold. The same way I adjusted to eating alone in my car because the office break room felt too loud. The same way I adjusted to missing birthdays and festivals and the 10,000 ordinary moments that you never think to grieve until they are already gone. The years moved the way years do when you are waiting for something. Slowly when you are paying attention. Impossibly fast when you look back. I changed apartments twice. I got a better job at a larger company. I bought furniture that actually belonged to me instead of sleeping on a borrowed mattress. I learned where the good grocery stores were, which gas station had the cheapest prices, which roads to avoid on Friday evenings. I learned the rhythms of a city that was not mine, and I learned them well enough that sometimes, for a few hours at a time, I almost forgot that I had ever belonged anywhere else. My brothers, all 6 of them, found their own rhythms back home. Rakesh, the oldest, opened a small business. Vinod got married in the spring of 2017, then Suresh 2 years after that, then Deepak. I attended all of their weddings the same way, on a small screen propped against a water glass in whatever room I happened to be in at the time, watching the ceremony with one eye and watching the battery percentage with the other, terrified of losing the connection. When Vinod's wife walked through the doorway and I saw my mother crying in the second row, I felt something shift inside me that I didn't have a name for. Not sadness exactly, something older than sadness. But I stayed, because staying was the thing that made sense. Because the process was moving, slowly, but moving. Because I had come this far, and the only thing worse than waiting 11 years would be giving up after 10. My father had a health scare in 2019. I found out at 2 in the morning when my phone rang, and I answered it without being fully awake and heard my mother's voice doing that thing where it is very controlled because it is trying not to be the opposite. He was stable. It had happened quickly, and they had gotten him to a hospital and he was going to be okay. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time after the call ended. I did not go home. I told myself it was because of the visa complications, the risk of delays, the timing of a project at work that couldn't wait. And those things were true, but they were not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I had gotten so used to managing distance that I had started to mistake managing it for accepting it. I sent money for the hospital bills. I called every day for 3 weeks. When my father came home and got back on the phone himself, his voice sounding smaller than I remembered, he told me not to worry. He said I was doing the right thing being over there. He said he was proud of me. I thanked him and got off the call and went to the bathroom and ran the water so my roommate wouldn't hear anything. That was the year I started going to the Indian restaurant near my apartment. I had avoided it before because it made the distance feel too immediate, too physical, like a smell that carries a memory you weren't prepared for. But after my father's scare, I started going once a week and sitting at the same corner table and ordering the same things and letting myself feel whatever came up. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt important. The green card process kept moving. My lawyer sent updates every few months. I tracked the government's processing timelines the way other people track weather forecasts, compulsively, and with the full knowledge that the information might change before it was ever useful. I waited. I worked. I called home. I watched the years arrange themselves into a shape I had not planned for, but had somehow built anyway. And then, on a Wednesday morning in March, 11 years after that first flight, 11 years after that parking lot meeting where I did the math and felt the weight of numbers I couldn't change, an envelope arrived. Green, with my name on it. I held it in my hands for a while before I opened it. I put the card on my kitchen counter and made coffee. That is the honest version of what happened the morning the green card arrived. No celebration, no phone calls, no photograph sent to anyone. I made coffee the same way I make it every morning, with too much water and not enough patience. And I stood at the counter and looked at the card while the coffee brewed, and I tried to locate inside myself the feeling that 11 years of waiting was supposed to produce. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something quieter and harder to name. Not disappointment exactly, not relief exactly. Something that lived between those two things in a space I didn't have a word for yet. I picked the card up again and turned it over in my hands. My name was spelled correctly. My photograph looked like a man I recognized but wouldn't necessarily call familiar. I put it back down and poured my coffee and went to work. My colleagues found out within a few days. Someone in HR mentioned it, the way HR sometimes does, and by Thursday afternoon 3 different people had stopped by my desk to shake my hand and tell me congratulations. One of them, a man named David who had worked next to me for 4 years and knew almost nothing about my life outside the office, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "11 years, man. That's insane. You must be so relieved." I told him I was. He seemed satisfied with that and went back to his desk. I called my mother that evening and told her. She cried. Not the controlled version of crying I had heard from her during my father's health scare, but the full and uncomplicated version, the kind that doesn't try to manage itself. She called my father to the phone, and he got on and said, "Good, good," in that way he has where 2 words are meant to carry everything he doesn't know how to say out loud. Then she called my brothers in one by one, and each of them said something, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets and listened to all of them being happy for me. I was glad they were happy. I want to be clear about that. Their happiness was real, and I received it with both hands. But when the call ended and the apartment went quiet again, I sat there for another few minutes on the kitchen floor and looked at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the card on the counter had not changed a single thing about how I felt inside that room. The apartment was still the same size it had been the day before. The silence was the same quality. The refrigerator made the same noise it had been making for 2 years that I kept meaning to get fixed. The green card was supposed to be the moment when my life in America became something I had actually chosen, something I was staying in, because I wanted to, rather than because a document required me to. But sitting on that floor, I couldn't find the version of staying that felt like a choice. I could only find the version that felt like what I had always done. I didn't buy a plane ticket home that week. I told myself I was waiting for the right time. A project at work was in a critical phase. The flights were expensive. The timing wasn't ideal. All of that was true, and none of it was the real reason. The real reason was that I was afraid. Not of flying. Not of the journey. I had been afraid of something else for longer than I was willing to admit. And the green card arriving hadn't made that fear smaller. If anything, it had made it more visible. The way a light turned on in a dark room doesn't create what's in the room. It just makes it impossible to pretend the room is empty. I was afraid that I had become someone my family no longer fully recognized. Not because I had changed in obvious ways, not because I had abandoned anything deliberately, but because 9 years of distance does something to a person that is very hard to see while it is happening, and very hard to explain once it has. The brothers I grew up sharing walls with had become voices on a telephone. My parents had aged in photographs, and in the careful way my mother sometimes searched for things to tell me that didn't involve asking when I was coming home. My 6 nephews and nieces. Children I had watched be born through screens and sent gifts to through courier services, knew my name and my face and not much else. I was afraid of arriving and finding that I had waited too long, that my place at the table had been quietly rearranged around my absence, the way furniture gets moved in a room you're no longer using. The weeks after the green card arrived had a strange quality to them. My life looked exactly the same from the outside. I went to work. I called home on Sundays. I went to the grocery store and the gym and the Indian restaurant on Thursday evenings. But underneath all of it was something I couldn't settle. A question that had been growing for years that the arrival of the document had somehow brought to the surface. What was I doing here, exactly? I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean it as a genuine and practical question that I had never really allowed myself to sit with. I had come for opportunity. I had come to build something, to send money home, to make the sacrifice my parents believed in mean something, and I had done those things. The money had been sent. The career had been built. The sacrifice had meant something, or at least it had cost something, which sometimes looks the same from a distance. But I was 39 years old, and I had never been in a relationship that lasted more than a year. I had colleagues I liked and ate lunch with, but I couldn't name a single person in that city I would call at 2 a.m. if something went wrong. My apartment held my things but not my history. The streets outside knew my car but not my story. I had lived in this country for 9 years, and I had been, for most of those 9 years, profoundly and quietly alone. The green card was supposed to fix something. I understood now that I had been counting on it the way you sometimes count on a future event to resolve a present feeling, as if the document arriving would also arrive with an explanation of what the 11 years had been for, what they had built, who they had made me. It didn't come with any of that. It came in an envelope on a Wednesday morning, and it sat on my kitchen counter, and it was just a card. I started going to the restaurant more often after that. Not just Thursdays, sometimes Tuesdays, sometimes Saturday afternoons when the emptiness of the weekend had a particular weight to it. The owner, a man named Haresh who had been in the country for more than 30 years, had started recognizing me well enough to have my usual order ready before I sat down. I appreciated that more than I probably should have. Being known by your order is a small thing, but small things have a way of mattering more when the larger things are not giving you what you need. One evening in April, about 6 weeks after the green card arrived, Haresh came and sat at the table next to mine. The restaurant was quiet. He had a cup of tea. We talked about nothing important at first, the way two people do when they are feeling each other out. And then somewhere in the middle of a conversation about cricket, he said something that made me put my fork down. He said his father had died 3 years ago, back home, and that he had not been there. Not because he couldn't go. He had a green card. He had a passport. He had the means and the time. He hadn't gone because there was always something, always a reason that felt legitimate in the moment, always a next month that was more convenient than this month. And then there was no next month left. He said it without drama, just as a fact he had learned to carry. I drove home that night and sat in the parking lot of my building for a long time. The engine ran for a few minutes and then I turned it off and sat in the quiet and let what he had said find its way into the places inside me where I had been keeping things I wasn't ready to look at. I thought about my father saying good on the phone. I thought about my mother's hands on my face, the memory of them from so long ago that I wasn't sure anymore if I was remembering the feeling or just the idea of it. I thought about 6 nephews and nieces who called me uncle with the polite distance reserved for relatives who exist mostly in stories. I went upstairs and opened my laptop. I looked at flights to India for a long time before I did anything else. The flight was 14 hours and I slept for almost none of it. Not because the seat was uncomfortable, though it was, and not because the cabin was loud, though it had that particular quality of recycled air and muffled noise that long flights carry. I didn't sleep because I couldn't turn my mind off. I sat in the dark with the window shade down and the rest of the cabin breathing slowly around me, and I thought about what I was flying toward with the same intensity I had spent years trying not to think about it. 9 years. That was how long it had been since I had stood on Indian soil. 9 years since I had heard the specific noise of that airport, smelled that particular combination of diesel and jasmine, and something underneath both that I had never been able to name but always recognized. 9 years since I had been somewhere that knew me before I knew myself. I had left at 30. I was landing at 39. And somewhere in the arithmetic of those 9 years was a version of myself I was not entirely sure I would recognize. My brother Rakesh was waiting at the arrivals gate. I saw him before he saw me, and I stopped walking for just a moment because of his hair. He had always been the brother with the darkest hair, thick and completely black. And now there was silver at his temples that the video calls had never quite shown me clearly enough to register. He looked, in that first unguarded moment, like my father. Not dramatically, not in a way that would strike a stranger, but in the way that a man starts to look like his father when he is no longer young, around the eyes and in the set of the shoulders. And I felt something move through me that I wasn't prepared for. He spotted me, and his face changed entirely, and he came forward and hugged me the way my brothers hug, which is hard and brief, and says everything it needs to say without prolonging itself. He took my bag without asking. We walked to the car without saying much. Some things between brothers don't require words to be understood. The drive home took 40 minutes, and I spent most of it looking out the window. The city had changed in ways I could feel but not quite articulate. New buildings where I remembered empty lots, roads that had been widened, shops with different names in places where I had known other names. But underneath all of that, something unchanged and fundamental. A rhythm to the streets that my body recognized before my mind caught up. The particular way traffic moved here, the specific geometry of the intersections, the sound of horns that meant something different than American horns, more conversational, less aggressive, a language I had grown up speaking without knowing it was a language. I felt the city in my chest the whole drive. Not nostalgia exactly, something more complicated. Recognition mixed with the awareness of having been away. Like hearing a song you loved when you were young, how it is both the song and also the distance between you and the person who first loved it. We pulled up to the house as the evening was beginning. The house looked smaller than I remembered, which I knew was not a fact about the house, but a fact about the distance memory puts between you and the places that formed you. The bougainvillea my mother had planted along the front wall had grown considerably, thick and sprawling and very pink against the white plaster. I stood outside for a moment before going in. My mother was in the kitchen. She heard us come through the door, and she came out wiping her hands on her dupatta. And when she saw me, she stopped walking and just looked at me for a moment. Then she crossed the room and put both of her hands on my face the way she used to do when I was a child, her palms against my cheeks. And she looked at me carefully, the way you look at something you want to memorize. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. My father was in the sitting room, in the same chair he has occupied for as long as I can remember, the one near the window that gets the evening light. He stood up when I came in, more slowly than I remembered him standing, and he reached out and shook my hand. My father shakes hands with his sons. It is how he was taught to show things that he feels too deeply to perform. I shook his hand and looked at him, and thought about 2 in the morning in 2019, sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, calculating visa risks while my father lay in a hospital. The first evening passed in the way of first evenings after long absences. Food appeared continuously. My brothers arrived one by one with their families. The house filled with noise and movement, and the particular energy of a large family reassembling itself around someone who has been missing from it. My sisters-in-law welcomed me warmly and asked questions about America with the polite curiosity of people who have heard about a place without ever needing to go there. My brothers talked over each other the way they always had, each one telling the same story differently, and something about that specific chaos felt so familiar and so lost to me at the same time that I had to excuse myself at one point and stand in the kitchen alone for a few minutes. The nephews and nieces were what I had been most nervous about, and they were exactly what I had feared. Not unkind, not unwelcoming, but careful with me in the way children are careful with adults they don't quite know. The youngest ones hid behind their mothers and looked at me with enormous eyes. The older ones were polite and slightly formal, calling me uncle with a respectfulness that had no warmth behind it yet, the warmth of strangers doing the right thing. I had sent them birthday gifts for years. I had video called on their holidays. I was a presence in their lives the way a photograph on a wall is a presence, acknowledged, recognized, not quite real. I had missed the years when I would have become real to them. The days that followed had a texture I struggled to process. On one hand, everything about being there felt right in a way that nothing in my American life had felt in years. Waking up to sounds I recognized. Eating food that tasted the way food was supposed to taste. Sitting with my parents in the evening without a screen between us. Walking streets that held 20 years of my own history in their intersections and corners, and the particular smell of certain neighborhoods at certain times of day. On the other hand, I kept bumping into the shape of my own absence. My brothers had routines and references I wasn't part of. Conversations would reference things that had happened over the past 9 years. A family dispute, a neighbor's story, a decision that had been made, and I would smile and nod and understand the words, but miss the texture of having been there when it happened. My parents had a rhythm with each other, and with their sons who were present that I was adjacent to, but not inside. I was welcomed completely and included genuinely, and I still felt, in moments I'd tried not to acknowledge, like a guest in a place that used to be mine. One afternoon I went alone to the neighborhood where I had grown up, just to walk. The tea stall where my friends and I had spent entire evenings was gone. The building where my closest childhood friend had lived had been painted a different color and had different curtains in the windows. I stood on a corner I had stood on hundreds of times before, and I understood something that I had been circling without landing on for years. Home is not a place that waits for you. It keeps moving whether you are there or not. The people in it grow older and the buildings change and the relationships develop without you. And the version of home you carry inside you while you are away is a photograph of something that was true once and is now something different. Not worse, not better, just different. And returning doesn't take you back to the photograph. It takes you to the present moment, which includes all the years you missed. I sat with my father one morning while my mother was at the market, just the two of us. He asked me about my work in the way he always asks, practically, specifically, as if the details of software engineering are something he has studied so he can ask informed questions. I answered him, and then there was a quiet between us, and he looked out the window at the bougainvillea, and he said, without turning to look at me, that he was glad I had come. I told him I was sorry it had taken so long. He shook his head once, the small decisive shake he uses when he is closing a topic. He said I had done what I needed to do. He said he understood, and I sat there and received what he was saying, and also heard underneath it, in the silence around the words, everything that understanding had cost him, the 2 in the morning phone calls he had made and unmade in his head, the milestones he had watched through small screens, the years of not asking when I was coming back because he knew I didn't have a good answer. My father understood. He had decided to understand. That is a different thing from it having been easy. On my last evening there, my mother made the meal she always made for important occasions. The whole family came again. The house was loud and full and warm, and I sat in the middle of it and tried to memorize everything. The sound of all of them together, the way the evening light came through the window, the smell of the kitchen, my father in his chair, my mother moving between the rooms with the efficiency of someone who has organized chaos her whole life and made it look like peace. I watched all of it, and I thought about my apartment back in America, the refrigerator that made that noise, the corner table at the restaurant where Haresh would have my order ready before I sat down, the office where people knew my work and almost nothing else, the city that knew my car and not my story. I took the return flight 2 weeks after I arrived. My mother made coffee the morning I left with cardamom, the way I like it. My father drove me to the airport before sunrise. When I reached the security line and turned back, he was standing in the same place he had stood 9 years ago, both hands at his sides, watching me go. Except this time, I was the one who looked different. The apartment felt smaller when I came back. Not physically. The walls were exactly where I had left them. The furniture hadn't moved. The refrigerator was still making that noise I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. But something about having spent 2 weeks inside a house full of people who had known me my entire life made the one-bedroom apartment in the American Midwest feel like what it actually was. A place I slept. A place I kept my things. A place that had never once asked anything of me beyond the monthly rent, and had never once given me anything beyond shelter in return. I unpacked my suitcase slowly. My mother had put things inside it without telling me. A small container of the spice mix she makes herself, the one I can never find an equivalent of here. A photograph of the family taken the last evening, all of us together in the sitting room. My father in his chair, my mother standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, my brothers and their wives and the children arranged around them. I put the photograph on the kitchen counter next to where the green card still sat, and I stood there looking at both of them for a long time. A document and a photograph. Everything I had built here and everything I had left behind, sitting side by side on a kitchen counter in a city that didn't know my name. I went back to work the following Monday. My colleagues asked about the trip the way colleagues do, briefly and with the assumption that everything is fine, and I said it was good and that it was nice to see family, and they nodded and moved on, because there is no real language in a professional setting for what I had actually experienced. How do you explain to someone over coffee in an office break room that you went home for the first time in 9 years and came back understanding that you had been living half a life and had mistaken the half you were living for the whole? You don't. You say it was good and you go back to your desk. But something had shifted inside me in a way that I couldn't unshift. The trip had done what I think some part of me had always been afraid it would do. It had made things real that I had been managing at a comfortable distance. My parents were not old in the abstract way that parents are old when you carry them mostly as voices on a telephone. They were old in the specific and physical way of people whose bodies were telling them things that bodies eventually tell everyone. My father moved more carefully than he used to. My mother tired in the evenings in a way she hadn't when I was young. They were healthy, as far as I knew, and I was grateful for that. But I had looked at both of them during those 2 weeks with the eyes of someone who understood, more clearly than ever before, that there was a number of visits left that was not infinite. I didn't know what that number was. Nobody does. But I knew it was smaller than I had been treating it. The weeks after I returned had a quality of restlessness that I hadn't experienced before, or maybe hadn't allowed myself to experience before. I had always been good at settling, at finding the rhythm of a situation and matching it, and making peace with the constraints. It was the quality that had gotten me through 11 years of waiting without falling apart. But now the settling wasn't coming. I would sit at my desk and find my mind in my father's sitting room. I would walk to the grocery store and hear, somewhere underneath the ambient noise of the American Midwest, the sound of traffic from home. I would eat lunch alone at my desk and think about the last evening at my mother's table with all of them around it. I started writing things down, not in any formal way, just in a notebook I bought from the drugstore, the kind with a plain cover and lined pages. I wrote down the things I had been thinking, and the things I had understood on the trip, and the questions I had been carrying for a long time without looking at directly. It helped to see them outside of my head. Questions look different when they are written down. They become more answerable somehow, or at least more honest about what they are actually asking. The central question, the one that kept appearing no matter how many pages I filled around it, was simple and enormous at the same time. What did I actually want? Not what made sense. Not what was practical or responsible or what could be justified to my parents or explained to my colleagues. What did I, Arjun, 39 years old, 9 years in a country that had never fully become mine, actually want from the years I had left? I had never asked myself that question directly. I had asked versions of it, softer versions, more manageable versions. I had asked what the next career step was, and what the sensible financial decision was, and what the process required. But I had never sat down and asked what I wanted the texture of my daily life to feel like, who I wanted to be surrounded by, what I wanted to be building. That was not a career or a savings account, but an actual life with actual people in it who knew me in the full and unglamorous and complete way that people know each other when they have been present for each other over time. I talked to Haresh about it. He had become, over the months since that first real conversation, the closest thing I had to someone I could speak honestly with. He was a man who had made his own choices and lived with them long enough to have developed a kind of clarity about them that wasn't bitterness and wasn't peace, but was something honest in between. He listened to me the way people listen, when they recognize what you are describing because they have described it themselves. He told me that there is no version of this life that doesn't cost something. Staying costs something. Leaving costs something. Going back costs something. What matters, he said, turning his teacup slowly on the table, is whether you are paying the cost of something you chose or the cost of something that simply happened to you while you were waiting for something else. I drove home from that conversation and sat in the parking lot again, the same parking lot where I had sat 6 weeks after the green card arrived, and I thought about what he had said until I understood what I needed to do with it. I had spent 11 years paying the cost of waiting. I was not willing to spend the next 11 paying the cost of inertia. I requested a meeting with my manager the following week. She was a practical woman who respected directness, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about her, and I told her what I was considering: full remote work, operating from India, with the understanding that I would travel back to the United States for major projects and quarterly meetings. I had done the research. The company had remote employees in multiple countries. The infrastructure existed. The question was whether my role specifically could accommodate it. She didn't give me an answer that day. She said she would think about it and talk to the relevant people and come back to me. I thanked her and went back to my desk and sat with the fact that I had finally said out loud the thing I had been thinking for months. There is something that becomes possible once you say a thing out loud. It stops being a private idea and starts being a direction. The answer came 3 weeks later. Yes, with conditions. Quarterly visits minimum, more during critical project phases, a trial period of 1 year, a formal review at the end to assess whether the arrangement was working for both sides. It was not everything I had asked for, and it was more than I had expected, which is usually how reasonable outcomes arrive. I called my mother that evening and told her. She went quiet in the way she goes quiet when she is processing something she wants to respond to carefully. Then she asked when I was coming, and I told her I was planning for the end of the year, permanently, barring the travel requirements for work. She called my father to the phone and told him, and I heard him say, from somewhere away from the receiver, the same 2 words he always says: "Good, good. I am writing this from my apartment. The boxes are mostly packed. The furniture I accumulated over 9 years is either sold or donated or being shipped. And the apartment is starting to look the way it looked when I first arrived, bare and echoing slightly, a space between things rather than a place. The photograph of my family is already packed carefully between 2 shirts so it won't get bent. The green card is in my wallet, where it has been since it arrived, small and green and finally serving the purpose it was always supposed to serve, giving me the freedom to go where I actually want to be. I think about the man who left India 9 years ago with 1 suitcase and a plan that made complete sense and no understanding of what it would cost. I don't regret going. I want to be clear about that. The years were hard in ways I couldn't have predicted, and they were also mine in a way that nothing else has been. I learned things about myself that I couldn't have learned any other way. I built things I am genuinely proud of. I became, in some important ways, someone I respect. But I also lost things. Years of ordinary evenings with my parents. The unremarkable daily presence that is actually the substance of a family. Not the holidays and the milestones, but the Tuesday dinners and the Sunday mornings, and the 10,000 small moments that you never think to count until you understand that they are what a life is actually made of. I cannot get those years back. I know that. What I can do is decide that the years ahead will be counted differently. My father is in his chair by the window. My mother is in her kitchen. My brothers are living their lives in the city where we all grew up, in the streets and rhythms that formed all of us. And there are 6 children growing up in that world who will, given time and presence, learn to see me as something more than a photograph on a wall. The green card took 11 years to arrive. It took another several months after that for me to understand what it was actually giving me. It was not giving me America. I already had that, more of it than I had perhaps needed. It was giving me the freedom to finally, deliberately, with full understanding of what it cost and what it was worth, choose something else. I leave in 6 weeks. For the first time in a very long time, I am not waiting for anything.